I'm standing outside a building I've never been to before, holding an envelope so thick my hands won't stop shaking. She did this every Monday for 35 years. Same day, same bank, same quiet routine I never questioned because I trusted her completely. I trusted her so deeply that I never followed the money, never asked where it went, never thought twice about it. After she passed away, I did follow it. And what I found made my hands shake so hard I had to sit down on the curb just to breathe. If you've ever trusted someone so deeply that you never checked the details, this true story will stay with you. I'm talking about the kind of trust where you don't ask questions because asking feels like doubting, and doubting feels like betrayal. My wife handled our finances for 35 years, and I never once looked over her shoulder. Not because I was careless, but because I believed in her completely. She was the foundation of our home, the one who kept everything standing while I focused on running my grocery store and making sure we had enough. But here's what I learned too late. Sometimes the people we trust the most carry burdens we never see, and those burdens leave trails we only follow when it's too late to say thank you. So subscribe now by clicking the button below and stay with me, because the truth I found waited 35 years to surface, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the woman I loved. My name is Henry, and I'm 70 years old now. I've spent most of my life doing one thing, running a small grocery store on Maple Street in a quiet town where everybody knows your name and your business. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it gave my wife Grace and me a comfortable life. We got married when I was 22 and she was 20, back in a time when people still believed that love and hard work could build something solid that would last forever. Grace was the kind of woman who could organize chaos into order, always keeping track of bills, receipts, and bank statements while I focused on stocking shelves and making sure Mrs. Patterson got her favorite brand of coffee every Thursday. We had our roles, and they fit together like puzzle pieces that never needed forcing. She took care of the money, and I took care of the store, and for 35 years, that system worked without a single crack showing. But there was one thing Grace did every single Monday that I never really thought about until it was too late to ask her why. Every Monday morning, like clockwork, she'd get dressed in her simple blue cardigan, grab her brown leather purse, and head to First National Bank on the corner of 5th and Main. Same time, same place, same routine, week after week, year after year. I'd be opening the store at 6 in the morning, stocking shelves with canned goods and fresh produce, greeting the early customers who came in for their morning coffee and newspapers, and Grace would be gone for about an hour, sometimes a little more. When she came back, she'd be quiet, sometimes a little tired, sometimes with this faraway look in her eyes like she'd been somewhere I couldn't follow. I never asked where the money went because I trusted her completely, and because in a good marriage, you don't interrogate your partner over every little detail. She never explained, and I never pushed. And that silence felt normal because our love was steady and our life was predictable. Looking back now, I realize how easy it is to mistake routine for transparency. When you see someone do the same thing week after week, year after year, your brain stops registering it as unusual. It just becomes part of the landscape, like the way the sun rises over the hardware store across the street or the way my shop smells like fresh bread every morning when I turn on the ovens. I saw Grace leave every Monday at 9:30, and I saw her return around 10:45, and somewhere in between, I stopped wondering what happened in that gap. That's what trust does. It makes you comfortable with not knowing. And when love is steady, routine becomes invisible. You stop seeing the details because you're too busy living inside the bigger picture, and the bigger picture was simple. We were happy. We were stable. We had enough money to pay our bills and take a vacation to the lake every summer. And we were together. That was all that mattered to me. Grace never acted suspicious, never seemed nervous, never gave me a reason to doubt her. If anything, she seemed lighter on Mondays. Like whatever she was doing at that bank gave her a sense of purpose I didn't fully understand. There were moments when I'd catch her staring out the kitchen window after she got back, her hands folded in her lap, her face soft with something I couldn't name, but that looked almost like peace mixed with sadness. Once, maybe 10 years into our marriage, I was restocking the dairy section when she came back from the bank, and I noticed her eyes were a little red. I asked her if everything was okay, if someone at the bank had given her trouble or if she needed me to go down there with her next time. She looked at me with those calm hazel eyes and said, "Just something I take care of. Henry, nothing for you to worry about." That was it. No details, no drama, just a simple answer that I accepted because I respected her privacy and because I trusted her judgment completely. But trust, I've learned, can be a double-edged thing. It protects you from worry, but it also keeps you from seeing the whole picture, from understanding what the person you love is really carrying. For 35 years, I lived inside a marriage I thought I understood completely, never realizing that Grace was carrying something I couldn't see, something she never asked me to help her with. And the worst part, she never asked me to help her carry it. She just did it alone, week after week, year after year, until the weight of it became part of who she was, woven into the fabric of our Monday mornings like thread you can't pull out without unraveling everything. I didn't know it then, but that Monday routine wasn't just about withdrawing money from our account. It was about something deeper, something she kept hidden not because she didn't trust me, but because she didn't want it to change the way I saw her or the life we'd built together. Now that I think back on it, there were signs I should have noticed, little cracks in the routine that I just brushed off because I didn't want to seem like I was prying into Grace's business. She'd come back from the bank on Mondays, and sometimes she'd be quiet for the rest of the day. Not in a cold way, but in a way that felt like she'd left part of herself somewhere else and couldn't quite bring it back home. I'd ask how her morning went while I was ringing up customers at the register, and she'd smile that soft smile of hers and say, "Fine, Henry," and that would be the end of it. I never pushed because I didn't think I needed to. In my mind, if something was really wrong, she'd tell me. That's what married people do, right? They share the heavy stuff, the things that keep them up at night. But I was wrong about that, and it took me 35 years and her passing to figure it out. There were days when Grace would come home from First National and her eyes would be red, just a little, like she'd been crying but didn't want me to know about it. I'd notice it while she was putting away the few groceries she'd picked up on the way back, or while she was folding laundry in the living room. And I'd feel this tug in my chest like I should say something, like I should sit her down and ask what was really going on. But I never did. I told myself she was just tired from running errands, or maybe she'd run into an old friend from high school and got emotional talking about the past. Or maybe it was just allergies acting up because spring in our town could be brutal. I made up 100 small excuses because the alternative, that Grace was carrying something painful all by herself, felt too big to confront. And honestly, I think part of me didn't want to know. Ignorance isn't always bliss, but sometimes it's easier than facing the truth. Especially when the truth might mean admitting you weren't paying close enough attention to the person you promised to love and protect. One time, maybe 15 years into our marriage, I came home early from the store because our supplier's truck had broken down and I had nothing left to stock on the shelves. Grace was sitting at our old wooden kitchen table with a stack of papers spread out in front of her, and when I walked through the door, she quickly folded them up and slipped them into her brown leather purse like she was hiding something. It wasn't suspicious, not really, but it was fast, deliberate, like she didn't want me to see what she was working on. I asked her what she was organizing, and she said it was just some old utility bills and receipts she was sorting through for tax season. I believed her because why wouldn't I? Grace handled all our finances, kept every receipt, balanced our checkbook down to the penny, and I had no reason to think she was hiding anything from me. But now I realized that moment was one of many, where I could have asked more questions. Could have pulled out a chair and said, "Let me help you with that." But I didn't. I just kissed her on the forehead, told her not to work too hard, and went to take a shower. The thing about family betrayal, or at least what people think of as betrayal, is that it's not always loud and obvious like you see in the movies. Sometimes it's quiet and slow. Something that builds up over years until you can't see it anymore because it's become part of the foundation your whole life is built on. Grace wasn't betraying me in the traditional sense. I know that now. But she was keeping something from me, and that silence created a distance I didn't even realize was there until it was too late to cross it. I thought we told each other everything, that we were one of those couples who didn't have secrets. But the truth is, We only told each other what we thought the other person needed to hear. And what Grace thought I needed to hear was that everything was fine, that she had it all under control, that I didn't need to worry about anything except keeping the store running and making sure we had enough money to pay the mortgage. So I didn't worry. I just kept stocking shelves, kept serving customers, kept trusting her completely, kept living inside a marriage that felt whole, even though there was an entire part of it I never saw. Looking back, I think the worst part isn't that Grace kept a secret from me for 35 years. It's that I made it so easy for her to do it, so comfortable for her to carry that burden alone. I never asked the hard questions, never dug deeper when something felt off, never made space for her to tell me the truth, even if it was uncomfortable or complicated. I just accepted her answers at face value because it was easier than facing the possibility that something was wrong, that maybe my wife needed help and I was too blind or too comfortable to see it. And maybe that's the real lesson here, the one I wish I'd learned 35 years ago instead of now, when Grace is gone and I can't ask her why she did what she did. Trust is important in a marriage, but so is curiosity. So is paying attention to the small things. So is making sure the people you love know they don't have to carry everything alone, that you're there to help shoulder the weight even when they don't ask for it. Grace got sick in the spring, right when the dogwoods were blooming and everything in town was coming back to life. It started with a cough she couldn't shake, the kind that rattles deep in your chest and doesn't let go no matter how much tea or honey you drink. I told her to see Dr. Morrison, but she kept putting it off, saying she was fine, that it was just allergies or maybe a cold that was taking its time to clear up. By the time she finally went to the hospital, it had already spread too far. Lung cancer, stage 4. The doctor said there wasn't much they could do except make her comfortable. And I remember standing in that sterile white hallway, feeling like the floor had just disappeared from under my feet. We had 6 months together after that diagnosis, and I spent every single day trying to memorize the way she laughed, the way she hummed while cooking dinner, the way she'd reach for my hand when we watched television at night. She passed away on a Tuesday morning in October, with the leaves turning gold outside our bedroom window and me holding her hand while she took her last breath. The funeral was small, just family and a few close friends from church and the neighborhood. People brought casseroles and flowers and said all the things people say when someone dies, about how she's in a better place now and how her suffering is over. I nodded and thanked them, but honestly, I don't remember much from those first few weeks. Grief has a way of making everything blurry, like you're living underwater and can't quite hear what people are saying or understand what you're supposed to do next. I just moved through the days on autopilot, opening the store because I didn't know what else to do with myself, coming home to an empty house that still smelled like Grace's lavender soap. But then the paperwork started coming, and that's when grief stopped being abstract and started being brutally practical. There were insurance forms to fill out, accounts to close, bills to settle, documents to sign. Grace had always handled our finances, so I'd never really looked at our bank statements or knew which accounts we had or where she kept all the important papers. I found myself sitting at that same wooden kitchen table where she used to organize everything, surrounded by folders and envelopes and statements I didn't understand. I had to call the bank, the insurance company, the mortgage lender, and every single conversation felt like pulling teeth because I didn't know the answers to half the questions they were asking me. Grace had kept everything so organized, but she'd also kept it all to herself, and now I was drowning in details I should have known about years ago. That's when I found the account I'd never heard of before. I was going through a filing cabinet in our bedroom closet, looking for our life insurance policy, when I came across a folder labeled simply Monday in Grace's neat handwriting. Inside were bank statements from First National, but not from our regular checking account. This was a separate account, one I'd never seen before, with regular withdrawals going back decades, every Monday, like clockwork, the same amount. I sat on the edge of our bed with those statements spread out around me, and I started adding up the numbers in my head. It wasn't a fortune, but it wasn't small either. Over 35 years, it added up to more money than I'd ever imagined Grace was moving around without telling me. My hand started shaking as I flipped through page after page, year after year, seeing the same pattern repeat itself over and over. Grief delays pain, but paperwork delivers it with surgical precision. I realized in that moment that I'd been living inside a marriage I didn't fully understand, that the woman I'd loved for 35 years had been carrying out some kind of mission every single Monday that she'd never once mentioned to me. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was confused, and underneath that confusion was something that felt like fear. Where had all that money gone? Why had Grace kept it secret? Had she been in some kind of trouble I didn't know about? Had someone been blackmailing her, threatening her, forcing her to pay them off week after week for decades? The questions piled up faster than I could process them, and I realized that the only person who could answer them was gone, and I'd never have the chance to ask her why she did what she did. I spent the next 3 days doing nothing but organizing those bank statements, spreading them out across the kitchen table in chronological order like I was building some kind of map to a place I'd never been. I started with the oldest ones I could find, going all the way back to when Grace and I were in our 30s, and I worked my way forward year by year until I reached the present. Every single Monday, without fail, the same withdrawal. Sometimes the amount changed slightly to account for inflation or whatever Grace was adjusting for, but the pattern never broke. Not once in 35 years did she miss a Monday. Not when she had the flu so bad she could barely get out of bed. Not when we went on vacation, and I thought she was just relaxing by the lake with me. Not even during the 6 months when she was dying and could barely walk to the bathroom without help. Somehow, some way, that money kept moving. I pulled out a calculator and started adding up the totals, writing them down on a legal pad because I needed to see the numbers in my own handwriting to believe they were real. The first year alone was enough to make me sit back in my chair and stare at the ceiling. By the time I got to year 10, I had to stand up and walk around the house because my chest felt tight and I couldn't breathe right. By year 20, I was pacing back and forth in the living room trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And when I finally added up all 35 years, the total was enough to make my hands shake so hard I had to put the calculator down and grip the edge of the table just to steady myself. It wasn't a fortune, not the kind of money that would let you retire early or buy a mansion, but it was substantial. It was the kind of money that could have paid off our mortgage twice over, or sent a kid to college, or bought a new car every few years. But here's what really got me. The money didn't just disappear into thin air. It went somewhere specific, and Grace had been meticulous about tracking it. Every withdrawal had a corresponding notation in her handwriting, just a simple code that didn't mean anything to me at first. A series of letters and numbers that looked like some kind of reference system only she understood. I sat there staring at those codes for hours, trying to decode them like they were some kind of secret language Grace had invented to keep me out. I checked our tax returns, our insurance policies, every piece of paperwork I could find, but nothing matched up. Whatever Grace was doing with that money, she'd kept it completely separate from everything else in our lives, like it existed in a parallel universe I'd never been invited into. I knew I had to go back to First National and talk to someone who might remember Grace, someone who'd been working there long enough to know what she was doing every Monday for 3.5 decades. So I put on my coat, grabbed that thick envelope full of statements, and drove down to the bank on a cold November morning when the sky was gray and threatening snow. The lobby was quiet, just a few customers at the teller windows and a young woman at the information desk who looked like she'd started working there last week. I asked if there was anyone who'd been with the bank for a long time, someone who might remember a customer named Grace who came in every Monday. The young woman made a phone call, and a few minutes later, an older gentleman in a suit came out from the back offices and introduced himself as Mr. Patterson, the branch manager who'd been there for 40 years. I showed him the statements and asked if he remembered my wife, and his face changed immediately. He got this look that was part recognition and part something else, something that looked almost like respect mixed with sadness. He said he remembered Grace very well, that she'd been coming to that bank every Monday for as long as he could remember, and that she'd always been very specific about her instructions. He couldn't tell me everything because of privacy rules, even though Grace was gone, but he said enough to point me in the right direction. He said the money went to a specific account that Grace had set up decades ago, and that account had a beneficiary address attached to it. He wrote down the address on a piece of paper, folded it carefully, and handed it to me across his desk. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Your wife was a remarkable woman, Henry. What she did took real courage." I didn't understand what he meant, but I thanked him and walked out of that bank with the address burning a hole in my coat pocket. I sat in my truck outside the bank for 20 minutes just staring at that piece of paper Mr. Patterson had given me, trying to work up the courage to unfold it and see where it led. My hands were cold even though the heater was running, and I kept thinking about all the times Grace had made this same drive, following this same route to wherever that address would take me. Finally, I unfolded the paper and read the address. 1247 Oakwood Avenue, about 15 miles outside of town, in a neighborhood I'd only driven through a handful of times in my life. It wasn't a bad area, just quiet and older, the kind of place where houses sat far back from the road and trees grew thick enough to block out most of the sunlight. I put the address into my phone, started the engine, and began following the directions like I was following breadcrumbs Grace had left behind 35 years ago. The drive took about 25 minutes, and the whole time my mind was racing through possibilities that didn't make any sense. Maybe Grace had been helping a relative I didn't know about. Some distant cousin or aunt who'd fallen on hard times and needed support. Maybe she'd been paying off some old family debt her parents had left behind when they passed. Maybe she'd gotten involved in some kind of charity work she was too humble to mention. Every scenario I came up with felt both possible and completely wrong at the same time, like I was trying to solve a puzzle without having all the pieces. The truth was, I had no idea what I was going to find at the end of this drive, and that uncertainty made my stomach twist into knots. When I finally pulled onto Oakwood Avenue, I slowed down and started looking at the house numbers, counting up until I reached 1247. It was a simple two-story building with pale yellow siding and white shutters, set back from the road with a small parking lot in front. There was a sign near the entrance, but I was too far away to read it clearly, so I pulled into the lot and parked near the front. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and for a moment I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at that building and trying to understand what it was. It didn't look like a house. It looked more like some kind of facility, maybe a small office building or a community center. There were a few cars in the parking lot, and I could see lights on inside through the windows on the first floor. I got out of the truck and walked slowly toward the entrance, and that's when I finally saw the sign clearly. My legs almost gave out from under me, and I had to stop and lean against a nearby tree just to catch my breath. The sign read Oakwood Children's Home, and underneath, in smaller letters, it said, "A safe haven since 1962. I stood there staring at those words, reading them over and over again like they were written in a foreign language I was trying to translate. A children's home. Grace had been sending money to a children's home every single Monday for 35 years, and she'd never once mentioned it to me. Not during dinner conversations, not during our quiet evenings watching television, not even during those last 6 months when she knew she was dying and had every opportunity to tell me the truth. I walked up to the front door, but I couldn't make myself open it, couldn't make myself go inside and ask the questions that were burning in my chest. Instead, I just stood there on the front steps with my hand on the door handle, frozen between wanting to know everything and being terrified of what I might find out. What if Grace had a child I didn't know about? A child she'd given up before we met? What if she'd been supporting someone else's family all these years? Someone she cared about more than she cared about our life together? The thoughts came fast and ugly, and I hated myself for thinking them, but I couldn't stop. Some doors stay closed because we're not ready to understand what's inside. And standing there on those steps, I realized I might not ever be ready for whatever truth was waiting on the other side. I turned away from that door and walked back to my truck like a man in a daze, but I didn't drive home. Instead, I drove 2 blocks down and found a small park with a few benches overlooking a pond where ducks were swimming in lazy circles. I parked, got out, and sat down on one of those benches even though the wood was cold and damp from the morning frost. I needed to think. Needed to process what I'd just seen before I could go back and walk through that door. Grace had been sending money to a children's home for 35 years, every single Monday without fail. And I had no idea why. The questions were piling up so fast I couldn't sort through them, couldn't organize them into anything that made sense. Had she worked there before we met? Had she volunteered there and never told me? Had someone she loved lived there once? Someone she was trying to help or honor or remember? I sat there watching those ducks and thinking about all the conversations Grace and I had over the years. All the quiet evenings and lazy Sunday mornings when we talked about everything and nothing at the same time. We talked about the store, about what we were going to have for dinner, about the neighbors and their drama, about whether we should repaint the living room or just leave it the way it was. We talked about small things and big things, about our hopes and our fears and our plans for retirement. But apparently, we never talked about the one thing that mattered most to her, the one thing she did every single week for more than 3 decades. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that maybe I'd never given her the space to tell me. Maybe I'd been so focused on running the store and keeping our life comfortable that I'd never stopped to ask what she needed, what she cared about, what kept her up at night when I was already asleep. I thought about the time she came home from the bank with red eyes, and how I'd convince myself it was allergies or exhaustion instead of asking her directly what was wrong. I thought about that day I came home early and found her folding up papers at the kitchen table, and how I'd just accepted her explanation without pushing deeper. I thought about all the Monday mornings when she'd leave the house with that faraway look in her eyes, and how I'd just kissed her goodbye and gone back to stocking shelves like it was the most normal thing in the world. Every single one of those moments was an opportunity I'd missed, a chance to understand my wife better, to help her carry whatever burden she was carrying. But I'd been too comfortable, too trusting, too willing to accept the surface version of our life without looking underneath to see what was really holding it all together. The worst part was realizing that Grace had probably wanted to tell me, had probably come close 100 times over the years, but stopped herself for reasons I'd never understand now. Maybe she thought I'd be angry about the money, or maybe she thought I wouldn't understand why it mattered so much to her. Maybe she was protecting me from something, or maybe she was protecting herself, keeping this one piece of her life separate and sacred in a way that had nothing to do with me at all. I'd spent 35 years thinking I knew everything about the woman I married, thinking our life together was completely transparent and honest and open. But sitting on that bench in the cold November air, I realized I'd only known the parts of Grace she'd chosen to show me, and there was a whole other side of her I'd never seen, never even suspected existed. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe an hour, maybe more, just watching those ducks and trying to work up the courage to go back to that children's home and find out the truth. Part of me wanted to get in my truck and drive home, to leave this mystery unsolved and just remember Grace the way I'd always known her. But I knew I couldn't do that. Knew I'd spend the rest of my life wondering and questioning and second-guessing everything if I didn't walk through that door and ask the questions I should have asked 35 years ago. So finally, when the sun was starting to sink lower in the sky and the cold was seeping through my coat, I stood up, walked back to my truck, and drove those 2 blocks back to 1247 Oakwood Avenue. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked straight up to that door, pulled it open, and stepped inside. The inside of Oakwood Children's Home smelled like crayons and cleaning supplies. That specific combination you only find in places where kids spend their days. The lobby was small but warm, with colorful drawings taped to the walls and a worn couch sitting under a window that looked out onto the parking lot. There was a woman at the front desk, maybe in her 50s, with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked up when I walked in and smiled like she was used to greeting strangers who showed up unannounced. I stood there for a moment not knowing what to say, how to explain why I was there or what I was looking for. Finally, I just said my name was Henry, and that my wife Grace had been sending money here every Monday for 35 years, and I was trying to understand why. The woman's face changed immediately, softening into something that looked like recognition mixed with deep sadness. She stood up from her desk and came around to where I was standing, and she put her hand on my arm like we were old friends. She said her name was Carol, and that she'd been working at Oakwood for 23 years, and that everyone who'd ever worked there knew exactly who Grace was. She asked me to follow her, and she led me down a hallway lined with more children's drawings and photographs of smiling kids, past a playroom where I could hear laughter and the sound of toys being dragged across the floor. We ended up in a small office at the back of the building, and Carol gestured for me to sit down in a chair across from her desk. She pulled out a folder that had Grace's name written on the tab, and she opened it carefully like she was handling something precious. Carol told me that Grace had first come to Oakwood in the spring of 1990, 35 years ago, just a few months after the home had almost shut down due to lack of funding. She said Grace had read about it in the local newspaper, a small article buried in the back pages about how this children's home was struggling to keep its doors open and might have to turn away kids who had nowhere else to go. Carol said Grace had shown up one Monday morning without calling ahead, without making an appointment, and she'd asked to speak to whoever was in charge. She'd sat in this same office and asked how much money they needed to stay open, and when they told her, she'd written a check on the spot for the first month. Then she'd come back the next Monday, and the Monday after that, and she'd never stopped coming for 35 years. But here's the part that made my chest tighten and my eyes start to burn. Grace had made them promise never to put her name on anything, never to acknowledge her publicly, never to send thank you letters or recognition plaques or anything that would draw attention to what she was doing. Carol said Grace had been very clear about that from the beginning. She didn't want credit, didn't want recognition, didn't even want the kids to know her name. She just wanted to make sure that every child who needed a safe place to sleep and food to eat and someone to care about them had access to it. No questions asked. Over the years, Grace's weekly donations had paid for beds and clothes and school supplies, for birthday cakes and Christmas presents, for the salary of a night nurse and repairs to the roof when it started leaking. Carol pulled out a ledger that showed every single deposit Grace had made, and the numbers matched exactly with the withdrawals I'd found in our bank statements. Carol opened a drawer and pulled out an envelope with my name written on it in Grace's handwriting, and my hand started shaking so hard I almost couldn't take it from her. Carol said Grace had left it with them 6 months ago, right after she'd been diagnosed, with instructions to give it to me only if I ever came looking. I opened it with trembling fingers and pulled out a single piece of paper, a letter Grace had written in her careful script. It said, "Dear Henry, if you're reading this, it means you followed the money, and I'm sorry I never told you while I had the chance. I started helping Oakwood because I couldn't have children of my own, and it broke my heart in ways I never knew how to explain to you. I didn't want this to change how you saw me or our marriage. I didn't want you to think I was unhappy or that you weren't enough for me, because you were everything I ever needed. I just wanted these kids to have what I couldn't give us. I didn't want recognition or thanks. I just wanted it done. I love you, Henry. I always have, Grace." I sat in that small office, holding Grace's letter with tears running down my face, and I couldn't stop them, even though Carol was sitting right there watching me fall apart. I read those words over and over again, trying to absorb what Grace was telling me, trying to understand the weight she'd been carrying alone for 35 years. She couldn't have children. We'd never talked about it directly, never sat down and had that conversation because I'd just assumed we were waiting for the right time, and then the right time never came. And eventually I stopped thinking about it altogether. I'd been so focused on building the store, on making sure we had enough money and a comfortable life, that I'd never stopped to ask Grace if she was okay with the way things turned out. I'd never asked if she felt incomplete, if she lay awake at night thinking about the family we never had, if she needed something from me I wasn't giving her. And here's what really broke me. Grace had found a way to fill that emptiness without ever making me feel guilty about it, without ever making it my problem to solve. She'd taken her pain and turned it into something beautiful, something that helped dozens of kids over the years have a safe place to sleep and people who cared about them. She'd done it quietly, without fanfare, without needing anyone to tell her she was doing good work or that she was making a difference. She'd just done it, week after week, year after year, because it mattered to her in ways I'd never understood. And the worst part was that I could have been part of it. I could have gone with her on those Monday mornings, could have met the kids, Could have helped her carry that burden instead of letting her do it alone. But she'd never asked me to, and I'd never offered. And now it was too late to do anything except sit in this office and realize how much I'd missed. Carol handed me a tissue and told me to take my time. And then she started telling me stories about Grace that I'd never heard before. She said the kids at Oakwood had called Grace the Monday Lady because she came every week like clockwork, always with a smile and sometimes with cookies she'd baked the night before. She said Grace would sit in the playroom and read stories to the younger kids, or help the older ones with their homework, or just listen when they needed someone to talk to. Carol said there were kids who'd grown up and moved away who still sent letters to Oakwood asking about the Monday Lady, wanting to thank her for being there during the hardest times of their lives. She pulled out a box full of drawings and letters that kids had made for Grace over the years, things Grace had never taken home because she didn't want me to find them and start asking questions. I looked through that box with shaking hands, reading crayon-written thank you notes from kids who didn't know Grace's real name but knew she cared about them. There were drawings of a woman with brown hair and a kind smile, pictures of hearts and flowers and houses with the words, "Thank you, Monday Lady," written in wobbly letters across the top. There was a letter from a teenager who said Grace had helped him believe he could go to college, even though nobody in his family ever had. And another from a little girl who said Grace made her feel safe when everything else in her life felt scary. Every single piece of paper in that box was evidence of a life Grace had lived that I knew nothing about. A whole world she'd built on Monday mornings while I was stocking shelves and ringing up customers and thinking I understood everything about the woman I'd married. I didn't feel anger, not toward Grace and not toward myself, not really. What I felt was something heavier and harder to name, something that sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow. It was grief mixed with regret, mixed with a deep, aching respect for the woman who'd shared my life, but kept this part of herself separate because she thought it was the right thing to do. I never lost money to some scam or some secret addiction or some family betrayal like you hear about in revenge stories. What I lost was the chance to help Grace carry the burden, the opportunity to be part of something that mattered to her more than anything else in the world. I lost 35 years of Monday mornings when I could have been standing beside her instead of letting her stand alone, and that loss felt bigger than any amount of money could ever measure. I left Oakwood that day with Grace's letter folded carefully in my coat pocket and a decision already forming in my mind before I even reached my truck. The next Monday morning, I woke up early, got dressed, and drove to First National Bank at exactly 9:30, the same time Grace had gone for 35 years. I walked up to the teller window and made the same withdrawal Grace had made every week. And then I drove straight to Oakwood and handed the money to Carol. I told her I'd be back next Monday, and the Monday after that, and every Monday for as long as I was able to make the drive. Carol's eyes filled with tears, and she hugged me tight, and she said Grace would be so proud. I didn't do it for pride or recognition or to make myself feel better about the years I'd missed. I did it because it was the right thing to do, because it was what Grace had started, and I needed to help her finish it, even if she wasn't here to see it anymore. Every Monday now, I follow the same routine Grace followed for 3.5 decades. I go to the bank, I make the withdrawal, I drive to Oakwood, and I spend an hour or two with the kids. I read stories to the little ones, help the older ones with their math homework, listen when they need someone to talk to. They don't call me the Monday man or anything like that. Most of them just call me Henry, and that's fine with me. I'm not trying to replace Grace or become some kind of hero in this story. I'm just trying to do what she did, to show up consistently and care about kids who need someone to care about them. And you know what? It's changed me in ways I didn't expect. I feel closer to Grace now than I did when she was alive, like I finally understand the part of her heart she kept hidden from me all those years. Love doesn't always ask permission, and sometimes it doesn't even ask for understanding until it's too late to give it. Sometimes love just asks for trust and time, and the wisdom to follow the trail when the person you loved can no longer walk it with you. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world where you've loved someone deeply, where you've trusted someone completely, I want you to know that it's okay if you didn't see everything, didn't understand everything while they were still here. What matters is what you do with the truth once you find it. Has someone you loved ever carried a secret you never followed until it was too late? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because I'd love to hear your story too.